I thought right away of one of my sacred allies in this space, which is McKenzie, and he is one of the co-founders of the School of Mythopoetics. And we get to hold it down in our different countries and interweave in different ways. And I first saw him. I don't know if you remember this, Ian. Well, I know that you're going to remember it, but I got to see him in real time, in real space, when he produced this event that I had a major crush on. How often do you get to have a crush on an event? I had a crush on this event. It was a live interactive engagement thing with the story of Psyche and Eros. And it was so fun and so inspiring and so alive. And I thought, okay, I don't know who this dude is, but like we gotta keep circling. And that we've been able to do. I'm gonna find your bio. Sorry, I'm multitasking over here because our queen behind the scene is tending to some other things as well. I want to tell you a little bit about Ian if you haven't gotten to know him yet. And Ian he's a new paradigm filmmaker. I love that expression, a new paradigm filmmaker, writer, and exploring at the intersection of eros, emergence, and village. He's a co-founder of the School of Mythopoetics. He runs a lovely podcast. He he is a teacher. He is a sharer. He's got an amazing film out right now, which is really traveling maybe through a neighborhood in your hometown. And without further ado, I'm going to pass over the mic and enjoy your time. What I'll just say is, this is, hopefully this will be a very lively conversation, and we know that it's going to evoke a lot in all of you. And so, well, what an assumption. It might provoke something in some of you. There we go. But if something happens where you have a thought that you want to share, place in the chat box. And if you have a question then that you want it for them to mull around, then please be sure and also place that into the chat box. If you write question right by it, it's going to help us catch it so that we can weave you well in. So thank you.
Mm. Okay, there we go. Thank you for that, Leah. Thanks for convening this Sacred Storytelling Summit, and thanks for reaching out. Thanks for making it back from Burning Man, which I heard was a little soggy this year, a little muddy from the photos. But yeah, you made it back here for the summit, and here we are convening with these guests around this conversation, reviving the imaginal axis, mythopoetics for modern crises. That was the title that came to me when you reached out and said, "What do you want to talk about?" And just sort of, I was like, "Yeah, that would be it." And in some ways, I'm actually finding out what I mean when I mean that through this conversation. And that's also why I invited the guests on, so we could have a jam about it, because I see all of these guests doing that very thing, applying, I might call it like applied mythopoetics. And I'm going to do a little introduction for each of them before we launch in. But I've had the pleasure of being able to collaborate and jam already with each of them in different ways. And I'll start with Sophie Strand, who again came across my radar through a mutual friend in New York area. And I feel like I connected with you like just before, your rocket ship ignited. You're how about this? There's a phrase somebody said to me one time. It's very true, still true, which is it takes 10 years to be an overnight success. And I feel so much like that's present for you. It's like I see it, you've been cooking away, scribing, learning for so long. And then all of a sudden it was like something ignited, and your book, The Flowering Wand, came out around masculinity. And of course, followed up with The Madonna Secret, which is, I think now, lighting up bookshelves. And then another book on its way already. And so I feel like you're like sporulating very well these days. So delighted to have you here. And over to Cheng Thom, who most recently met, again, I can't remember how, maybe Instagram initially. But yeah, your name came up, and I was really impressed by what you were putting out in terms of your writing, your somatic education, your ability to hold a mythic lens. And there was a particular essay that caught my eye, which I think maybe you could share a bit later. It might be published by now, or maybe not. Yeah, it's called The Village in the Woods, something like that. And we had a great conversation on it through the School of Mythopoetics, and I was so deeply appreciative of that. And I thought, wow, I got to get Cheng Thom back here on this panel. So thank you for saying yes. And then to Alexander Beiner, who is joining us from Europe somewhere. It's late for him, so he's thankfully said yes. And Ali, as he's known for short, is, I believe, one of the co-founders of Rebel Wisdom, if not the co-founder, but I know there's a couple others there in collaboration with you, which was again a sort of a rebel inquiry into a lot of these themes. And then more recently, you've been, I think, focusing on your Substack as well as your new book, The Bigger Picture, which is also, I believe, lighting up bookstores around the world. So what a reason to come together and jam on this. So thank you all for joining me. And of course, to all of you who are tuning in from wherever you are tuning in from, this mysterious technology has allowed us to gather together somewhere in the cloud. And here we are. So I want to unmute as we jump into the beginning of this conversation. And I want to start with a very basic one, just to help with the foundations, because as I myself have been steeped in this mythopoetics for some time, but a lot of people don't actually know what that means, right? Or they may have a sort of general approximation. And so I actually just thought I would love if each of you answered, with some brevity, but just what do you understand is the term mythopoetics to mean, and what might its function be, which is also why I included it in the name of this panel. So again, any of you with the spirit moving you can maybe unmute and jump in.
I'll go.
Okay.
I always
Please
have something to say.
do.
I always word salad. I think for me, there is an assumption that myth, because we've conflated it with human language, belongs to human beings. But for me, myth is a dialogue that the environment has with itself. And humans are sometimes a participant in that, but they are not the sole author of it. Oftentimes they are like a side character. And for me, myth is, if we look back at the most ancient myths, they are personified elementals. It's a patch of soil where a community plants its best practices, its agricultural wisdom, its ancestral lineages. That, myth as an oral tradition is incredibly hardy. We have Aboriginal myths that are the oldest human knowledge that has been, successfully transmitted over many 37,000 years old myth, I think. It's the oldest piece of human knowledge that has been able to make it to us through boats of breath. And so for me, myth, and I think Sean Kane was one of the speakers in this week, who's one of my favorite mythopoetic thinkers, says that myth is really a dialogue with the earth about how it's like an ancient science. If science is a way of asking the earth questions, then myth is the original science. It's also provides accurate data. It might not be quantitative within our material reductionist paradigm, but it's incredibly accurate data. I mean, I think the Achenawi tribe in, I may be getting that incorrect, estimated in their mythic dialogue that the universe was 10,000 years old. Turns out they were totally correct. So for me, myth is an alternative science. It's a way of dialoguing with the earth and learning how to best be in relationship with it.
Thank you, Sophie.
Yeah, I could follow up on that because it's not dissimilar. I think what I think of when I think of mythopoetics. I'm right now thinking of actually a definition that I got on a panel like this just before the pandemic. It was like February 2020 in person. But there's a storyteller called Andreas Corneval, who people might be familiar with, and he said something that really stuck with me all through the pandemic, actually. Which was similar to what Sophie's saying, that legends come from people, but myths come from the land, and I think about that quite a lot. And I think certainly I think myths come from the land, but I think what's also interesting about that is that they come from beyond us somewhere. So they come from our collective unconscious. They sort of arise from somewhere, and act as a way to understand and make sense of the world. And so there's something around, there's also something about the transformational quality of mythopoetics that I think is important to kind of name. I think stories in maybe all stories, if you take the kind of Joseph Campbell or sort of Jungian sense, are about transformation. They're about a maturing and a growing of a human being. And so I think myth almost I kind of contextualize as, or I feel it as something bigger, like a collective version of that. It's almost the, we might have a story about somebody, but the myth is our story, our shared story of growth and change and evolution. So that's kind of, yeah, maybe I'll leave it there and hand over to Cheng Thom.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Ali.
Oh, I've done myself a disservice because I was like, I'm not going to go first. I'm going to let the others speak, and then they spoke, and I was like, oh, I'll never be as brilliant as that. I'm not going to say anything particularly different. I think maybe just a different way. I see myth as like a threshold, like a doorway or a bridge. It is the connection between the invisible and the visible, the seen and the unseen, the spiritual and the physical. For me, poetics is the act of speaking that bridge or that doorway into being. So mythopoetics for me is, whether it is done by human or non-human beings or forces, it is like the act of creating a portal between worlds. I think what's particularly impactful or powerful for me when I think about the work of Jung or some of the indigenous practices that both of you have already spoken of so beautifully, it's like that embodied act of connecting two worlds that we already belong to, right? Like we're already, we exist on multiple levels as human beings. I would imagine that non-human beings also exist on multiple levels, right? The physical and the spiritual. And creating that bridge allows us to feel greater wholeness and create a map of who we are. So yeah, I think that's where I'll leave it. The act of speaking the bridge into being.
Beautiful. Yeah, very rich entrance into this conversation. Before I go further, maybe Kat, yeah, do you want to write? We're just asking folks to write their comments, and then I can kind of weave them in at different times. Yeah. That sound good? Yeah. As we'll continue our journey in. Now, there seems to me a kind of mythic revival that's going on right now, or a mythopoetic revival, in that there's much more of a fascination, as well as almost like I would almost call it like a longing for a more, I don't know, tapestried sense of like, what is going on right now? Like, how did we get here? What are the forces at work? And oftentimes the like scientific rational paradigm doesn't provide a sense of, a sort of satisfying response to these questions, right? And that's one of the reasons why I spoke to this idea of reviving the imaginal axis, because I think we've sort of been lulled, or maybe modernity was sort of lulled itself into a sense that we don't live in mythic times anymore, right? Or sort of the myths became invisible, which I would say is actually kind of a dangerous time, right? If folks are like, oh yeah, we don't live in like that, that way, we're beyond myth. Then you're like, uh-oh, you're in dangerous times, because it seems like you basically just push them underground. And then, of course, they kind of run in the shadow. And so I wonder, again, I see some nodding heads, but if anyone wants to jump in and kind of speak to that, this mythic revival also meets this kind of longing for a more satisfying way of understanding the crises of the times.
I could make a foray into that, throw some stuff at the wall and see what sticks, right? Like, I really appreciate what you're saying, Ian, about the dangerous times. And this is what this essay, which is not yet published, but I am promising myself and the world it'll be out this weekend. Like, is about, in many ways. The forgetting of myth causes us to live them out, which we're always doing, living out myths, but living them out without awareness, which means that they're more, I might call them like demonic or regressive aspects, right? Emerge more powerfully because we're not making intentional choices about how we cultivate our collective story. And, I think that thing about modernity really makes me think about this kind of idea that was, I think, first propagated by the political scientist Francis Fukuyama, where he was talking about the end of history. Like that we've progressed so far as an international or global society that like myth making is over, and that historic events are over. And I think, this is really falling into the trap of confusing the strengths of the Enlightenment period with the weaknesses of the Enlightenment period, right? Like there's the beauty of the philosophical tradition and like seeking for truth, and then there is the shadow side of that, which is releasing mystery, or deluding ourselves into believing that we've defeated mystery, which of course we never can. And I think we see this revival of myth and mythopoetics now because we're in a transitional time. Like we are starting to experience the collapse that has come from that mistaking of Enlightenment weaknesses for Enlightenment strengths. And in order to survive that, I think people are awakening to that bridge between worlds. I mean, we literally are in a burning times, right? Like Hawaii, the Northwest Territories, Cologne, like the western part of British Columbia here in Canada, all on fire, and so many other places literally on fire. Like what else? What else could we turn to but myth making and poetics in order to understand and survive that? It's sort of what comes to me. We really need that because it's what we've always needed.
Hi, Cheng, I really, really love that summoning of the urgency of the fact that we are, our shores are susceptible to tidal waves, there are hurricanes, there's been smog, there's been fire, that, most people are post-apocalyptic right now. It's just only, people who've been sheltered who are taking this as a surprise this summer, but it is at our doorstep. And for me, what I really think about is, I think about how myths are incredibly durable ways of keeping knowledge alive. And then in fact, books, and when you offload your information into something that's not a relationship, that's not a place, that for hundreds of thousands of years, we used the landscape as mnemonic devices, and we used our relationships in place with land as a way of remembering huge, I always say ecology is not encyclopedias. The minute we start writing things down in encyclopedias, we're colonizing information without actually embodying it. That cultures that have encyclopedias actually have very little gold backing behind their words. That in oral cultures, you have a smaller vocabulary because each word has gold behind it, has a real relationship behind it. And for me, myths are an incredibly good arc. I think about the arc in Noah's flood, which is, I think that I'm pretty convinced all of the stuff we've offloaded into the digital cloud is going to disappear. Our technology is highly fragile. I'm actually kind of laughing at all these conversations about AI because the material extractive processes to even bring them about are so fragile. And, one tiny little thing, breaks, and that, those rearranged deck chairs in the Titanic don't matter anymore. What I'm really interested in is myth as a way of, if we have collapse, if our cultural connective tissue gets fragmented, myths are a way of saying, this was the most important story. This is the story of my community. And I want to send it on boats of breath through the bodies that make it through the bottleneck of collapse. That I always bring up, Hesiod's theogony. Archaeologists and anthropologists have shown that it's probably a pretty accurate recounting through a mythic lens of the explosion of Mount Terra. That probably, I think it was the explosion was equivalent to 40 atom bombs. It is in millions of people dead, pretty much the end of the Bronze Age. And that a myth got through that bottleneck and became Hesiod's theogony, which arrives to us today. So for me, myths, I think we're seeing a revitalization of a mythic interest because we know they are boats, they're vessels that can carry through, how do we plant food? How do we care for each other? How do we provide pain relief when someone's dying? Like these really basic things, we can plant them in a good story. Stories are much easier to remember than lists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a mic drop. Stories are much easier to remember than lists. Yes. Thanks for that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'd
Ellie.
love to build on both of those excellent points. And first, by maybe kicking the Enlightenment while it's down, because I love to do that. But I think this question. Okay, why a renewed interest in myth? I think okay, what one of the things the Enlightenment did was orient people in the West, in particular, and then large parts of the rest of the world away from an interest in the quality of our lived experience towards the quantity of things and measuring the quantity of things. That's really what the scientific endeavor is about. And that also then leads to a cultural story where we as human beings, our lived experience, the quality, as in what it's like to be you, or what it's like to be a dog or a frog or a tree or a river, that's at best secondary, or at worst not even real. There'll be neuroscientists who say like, well, no, you're not even a real person. None of us are real. This is just a kind of meat machine that's generating a kind of illusion of selfhood. So what that gives us is a story where we have the crises we're living through. I think it's one of the big generators of the crises, because it makes absolute sense to consume mindlessly if we don't mean anything and we're part of an uncaring machine-like cosmos that is basically just churning away. Now, that's actually not true scientifically. It's not. It's a completely outdated way of seeing the world. But it is the kind of cultural story we have. And I think one of the things that myth does is give us a map for qualitative experience. It actually gives us a map for understanding what it is to be alive, and what it is, not just for us to be alive, but what is it for the world to be alive? Because that's the other core thing that we lost with the Enlightenment, is that we lost what was pretty widespread across the world, which was a sense that the world is alive and speaking to us and in dialogue with us, so a kind of animistic or panpsychist view of reality. And without that, we have this deep emptiness at the core of our idea of what it is to be human. I think what myth can do is, give us that map of aliveness and quality, and brightness and magic back into the world. And I think it'll continue. I think that yearning it's an aberration that we've stepped away from that. I think we're the only people who have in this particular culture for the last 300-400 years. And we kind of we have to evolve beyond it, because it doesn't work. So, yeah.
Thank you, D3. Also some good comments, coming in on the chat. Kat shared that the traditions she named, as well as others that encode their creation stories still and still live by them. And thankfully, they're indigenous cultures that continue to do so, despite, again, ongoing colonization, as well as this sense of this relational entanglement through a kind of really achieved reciprocity. Like, this is something that I've just been so grateful for. I was recently at a gathering on Orcas Island, which is off the coast here in the US. And the opening ceremony was done by this fellow named Paul Chokton, who's a indigenous musician, storyteller. And the way he spoke was just, it was like he was just giving keys away to the audience, which is primarily of settlers. But he was just giving keys away because he's like, my grandma used to, paddle up here, like literally behind where the festival, ground is. And she'd be like, she'd paddle there. And before she'd go in the ocean, she would speak to it and say, thank you for providing as you do. And just this very humble and yet rich sort of living cosmology, that he was gracious enough, again, to just be like, here's all these keys of like how to be somewhere through these realms, through these portals. And hopefully they're landing, and they continue to land, and maybe that's also fueling this sense of the kind of the reciprocal enactment that myths ask. Actually, they kind of invite that, right? Otherwise, they become, I think, just intellectual wonderings, again. And so I want to shift gears a little bit too to a kind of function of myth, or mythopoetics, as a way to illuminate in a way like really sort of contemporary examples of storytelling. For example, I'll start with you, Ali. You wrote a great piece that was on the whole Barbenheimer phenomenon, right? It was in the collective, there's a really interesting moment, right, where Oppenheimer Oppenheimer the film and Barbie the film are coming out at the same time, and they kind of fused into this mimetic, phenomena, which was labeled, Barbenheimer. And you wrote a really interesting piece on it that I think was a good example of illuminating applied, or using applied mythopoetics to kind of break it out of a sense of, this is a movie about a doll, Mattel's, doll, and this is a film about the bomb. But there was like something other happening. And so for me, that's the imaginal axis that you were able to say, hey, look, what if we add this dimension, and then boom, 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 all these layers appear. So I'm not asking you to summarize the lengthy article, but hopefully I will share it after. But I would love for you just to, again, give an example of that, of how applying that lens was able to provide, right, a whole bunch of other insights about what may be going on in the collective.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, in general, the Barbenheimer is one example, but we see it all the time where things just erupt in culture, right? Like as if they're erupting from the collective unconscious, and they become now a meme, right? A meme appears. What is a meme? It's kind of like an archetype that kind of takes form and lives in the world. So if there's a meme, there's a reason for the meme, is my philosophy. And so I just get fascinated. I'm like, why is this happening? Because it could have been, for example, that Barbie and Oppenheimer both came out and people were like, that's kind of weird. They're both very different types of film. Meh. There's no memes. There's no kind of, energy behind it. That's an equally plausible thing. But if there is, then we can see there's some kind of mythic expression that wants to happen. And yeah, I won't go into the details of it, but I think part of what that was about was the intense polarity between the two films, both in the way they looked and what they were really about, and around the ideas of the masculine and the feminine, etc. So there's that whole aspect of it, but I think more deeply, something I've been exploring for a few years is this idea of the internet. This is where these memes are coming from, as a kind of mechanical collective unconscious. And if you think about it, all of our desires, hopes, dreams, the dark side, everything that we're putting into the internet, it acts like that. And AI now becomes this sort of conscious vessel that goes, okay, I'm going to gather all of that and then mirror it back to you, or to us. So in that sense, I think the internet is where we need to look to understand what is actually happening in culture. Because I think what happens is that these energies brew and then they erupt into the real world. So I call it breach. So it's a kind of, they breach into the real world, and the symbolic world meets the real world for a while, and then suddenly something changes. But that kind of symbolic reality doesn't last that long in the real world. The January 6th insurrection is a good example of that. You have these people in this mythic fantasy of QAnon, and then suddenly they're in the Capitol and they're like, they're kind of stepped beyond their reality into something that's actual reality. And I think that's a really extreme example, but that's happening all the time. And so it's happening even when films are coming out, and there's a kind of mimetic pull around the films. So it's always telling us something.
Yeah, thanks for that. I just want to name too. I like that term breach, like breaching from the mechanical unconscious in a way into the collective. I get curious, for example, like Me Too as an example of that, like this kind of collective, no more from, I don't know if we call it the feminine in a way, but channeled through largely women. But I also have a question too for Kai around your essay, because I do feel you're speaking to the trans phenomena in a way, and people's sort of vehement reactivity to it, as well as different positions on it. But you kind of did another thing. I feel like you kind of attended to the breach in a way through a mythopoetic lens. And so again, I'd love to sort of ask you as well to speak to that application of your ability to illuminate in such a way around this, again, this big moment around this.
Yeah, thanks so much for speaking that. Like the brief context of me that I'll give around that is, I have worked in various roles in the conflict resolution, restorative justice, and transformative justice field for quite a long time now. And in the wake of that eruption, or that breach, I love that term too, I'm going to remember it forever now, that was Me Too, which lasted for a long time, right? Like I would give it actually about a 4 or 5 year period that wave of eruption was happening. there were a lot of really confusing aspects to that. Some of which felt really like positive developments, and others that felt, pretty scary to me actually. The turn to mythopoetics for me was like, I've been a storyteller probably like most of the people in this room for a really long time, and a story listener for longer than that. And I was like, okay, well, like how can I make sense of what's happening? So this essay, The Village in the Woods, which again, I'm promising the world will be out, by the end of this weekend, is like a continuation of some of the writing work that I did earlier, looking at this mythic archetype of the village, the woods, the monster, and the innocent. What really fascinates me about that particular eruption or breach around Me Too, around harm and sexual predation, is like the fact that that's like a real thing, right? Like there is so much sexual predation in this world, so much violence that happens, and yeah, particularly toward the feminine, although we also know that 1 in 6 men or masculine identified people will report sexual assault or abuse at some point in their life. So also that's a huge number. But what's really fascinating is that's a real phenomenon. And then the like mimetic response to it, or the collective response to it, is not necessarily the helpful one. And we see that happening over and over and over throughout throughout at least Western history, but I think in other histories as well. The Village in the Woods particularly looks at the concept of social panic and sex panic as a form of mimetic eruption. So, we have Me Too, which again, I cannot say enough how right I think it is that we're pushing back, and many of us pushing back against patriarchal violence as a society. But I was very disturbed by the ways in which some of that collective response appeared to mirror sex panics that have happened, repeatedly throughout the 20th century, and the closeness with which Me Too has been followed by a resurgence of homophobia and transphobia here in the global North. So we are seeing, this massive, again, a mimetic eruption in Britain, in the United States, in Canada, and in Australia, like a surge of animosity towards transgender people. There's this massive fear about trans women using bathrooms, like public bathrooms, about children identifying as trans and transitioning. And listen, we could talk about the finer points of medical transition a lot. I think healthcare policy is something separate from this conversation. But what's really fascinating to me is like that air of panic, like this terror and the drive to rid ourselves of the impure, right? Like this, like there's a monster somewhere lurking in the woods, and there's a monster somewhere lurking in the heart. They mirror one another, and the monster in the woods might somehow bring that monster in the heart out of us, and then that will destroy, the archetypal village that we live in. This drive to cleanse and purify, the hatred of the shadow, and the belief that we can get rid of it by getting rid of so-called undesirables in society, whether that is the so-called predatory man or the transgender woman, who very often are actually collapsed into one inside of the collective imagination, is what terrifies me. And I think that's actually, this is this shadow operation of mythopoetics. Like that's us living out myth without being conscious of it. And what the essay and my work in general hopes to do is to point out, we're going to live out that story, whether or not we're conscious of it. If we are conscious, then we can really be thoughtful and like heartful in making differentiations, right? Like what happens when we decide to burn the witch or drive out the monster? By searching for impurity obsessively, what happens is that we end up destroying ourselves, because the monster lives within. And the solution to societal violence on a mythic level, on a practical level, generally is not violence or destruction. It is about integration on the individual level and the collective. It was a big old rant. I'm very sorry.
Beautiful, thank you. I'm curious to ask Sophie. One, I heard a lot of head nodding, so I figure things have been stirred for you. Maybe to respond to some of that, but also, of course, your recent book, The Madonna Secret. I don't fully understand it yet. I haven't read it quite yet, but I understand that it's like bringing a kind of I want to call it remythifying or something. I don't know if that's a word, but to the story of, well, maybe you could say it better, but I think that you're kind of choosing a focal point specifically with that book. For example, I mean, the previous one too was The Flowering Wand around masculinity. But I wonder again that why you choose these focal points as actual places to kind of remyth, right? Or restorify. And I'm really curious about that.
Well, first, just thank you, Ali, your essay on Barbenheimer was excellent. Your Substack is incredible. Your recent one on ego. Everyone who's not signed up, go sign up. And Kai-Cheng, everything you just said, I always say that I work by addition, not subtraction, that we live in a culture that is antibiotic, it is against life. We think we can clean things up, but resilient ecosystems are resilient in as much as they are dirty and messy and have more nodes of connectivity. So let's compost, we can't extract the monster, the toxin, the microplastics writing on our hemoglobin. We must learn how to collaborate with people who we don't agree with and, add enough onto the pile that it makes good soil. Yeah, you said it a lot better. It was beautiful. Thank you. I don't go ahead with a strategy. I'm not a highly non-strategic person. So I tend to approach stories, myths, ideas, paradigms that I'm obsessed with, that I can't get out of my head. And one of them has been, how does a anti-imperial, anti-agricultural, oral, healing kind of wild storyteller get co-opted by the very empire that killed him, used to kill his own people, and used as the figurehead of militaristic colonialism and ecocide. So I am not remythifying the story of Christianity. I was seeking to reroute it so that in its socio-political, ecological, inheritance in the mythologisms of the Mediterranean basin, to understand how it gets so badly co-opted, how it gets so mistranslated. And I always think that story does more heavy lifting than nonfiction. My first book was nonfiction. I never intended to publish it. Ian, we met like when it was still a Facebook post, I think. And then it was published, which, it didn't order it off the menu, but I'm glad it happened. But The Madonna Secret is my great love, which is I attempted to bring back to life the ecology of Galilee, of Second Temple period Palestine, the women, the people who had known waves of imperial oppression, the land that had been known waves of ecocide, and tried to understand what it meant to be a spiritual teacher responding to a highly traumatized people at that time period, and then failing. Like I tried to look at that in a really kaleidoscopic way with many different characters to create an ecosystem rather than, a monologuing hero's journey. And so I hope I accomplished something. I do think that story allows us to experiment with things that are not, it doesn't ever make a claim to expertism. I think story is a way of saying these are different perspectives. You decide, you pour yourself in, the text is open. I always love, when I think about myth, I think about this wonderful text by poet Lynn Higinian called The Rejection of Closure, which is one of my favorite essays. And it talks about how we, in the past 500 years, we've become very attached to closed texts, that texts that have a synthesis, that have a conclusion, that are linear, that have data to back up their points, and are hard to question. And written texts are hard to question. In an oral culture, a text is always an experience that ties you to people who can respond and interrupt. We have to remember that Jesus, who's the character I study and write about, was a person who had an interruptive pedagogy. He told stories that made people so angry they would want to interrupt him. We think that, the kingdom is a mustard seed is this cute little thing to say, but saying that to Galilean Jews farming land they didn't own that had been stolen from them, trying to feed their families and pay their taxes, that's saying this unjust moment in time where you don't understand anything and your family's being oppressed is the kingdom. And the weed that will make you starve to death is the kingdom. Like that inspires a kind of an engagement. It's not one person monologuing. It's like this, it's an argument, it's friction, it's tension, it's polarity, as Ali writes about. And it's in that polarity, that gradient between, you know, the mountain and the valley, that drives the shape, the topology of environments into being. And so I hope that we can create open texts, not closed texts, texts that invite interruption and invite, you know, reinterpretation. So when I try and compost these myths, I'm trying to do it in an incomplete, open way so that someone else can enter in and perhaps do better work than me.
Beautiful. Incomplete myth. You know, I'm tempted just to weave one more question to you, Sophie, too, just because I know as well you're a prolific poet. And the question that came up, can you speak about the poetic aspect of myth? And I suspect maybe Kai, Cheng, and Ali might be into poetry themselves. But maybe, Sophie, you could start and just speak, what is the realm of the poetic as well alongside the myth?
Well, Kai Cheng's saying that the poetic element is the bridge, is the threshold. Wow, I loved that. I think that beauty is an incredible tool. And I think that it engages our interoceptive intelligence, not our intellectual intelligence, but our embodied proprioceptive in our environments, in our organs, in our flesh being, that when we think something is beautiful, it's very hard to intellectualize it. And so poetry is a way of, for me, making people feel something, which goes back to what Ali said about, you know, it becomes a map of the qualities of our world. And the qualities of our world are what make us want to keep it alive. It is the quality of the peony, of the hawk screaming outside, of the smell of autumn mildew. These are things that we can't, you know, we can't create data sets of, but we can create poems of them. And for me, you know, mythology captures what science cannot. And the really beautiful thing would be if they could create an ecology of collaboration, if they could work together. I'm really interested in how science and myth can kind of collaborate with the quantitative and the qualitative. So for me, poetry is similar to science. It's a way of dialoguing with the qualitative aspects of the world.
Beautiful. Yeah, I'd love to just spin around the spiral here. Maybe over to you, Ali, with that as well.
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you, Sophie and Kai Cheng. This is just a real joy to listen to you both. So, the poetic aspect. I mean, what's coming up for me, especially just listening to Sophie share on that a second ago, is that, you know, the question, well, what's the point of poetry, right? There is no point to poetry in the traditional sense of, like, you know, achieving some kind of goal. Alan Watts has this beautiful phrase of around music in the same way, that basically if the point of music were quantity, then the best musicians would be the ones who played the fastest, and then it's just done as quickly as possible, then they go on to the next one, right? And it's similar to poetry. It's like, it's not like about how much poetry you make, it's the beauty, and it's like the thing itself. So I think there is this, like, we talk about myth, you know, myth I think has that quality as well, but myth has potentially, in the way we often understand it in the West and in this part of the world, it has a linearity to it, perhaps. And adding the poetic aspect to it frees us, because we can feel it for what it truly is. And somehow I think we need that word with it, because our minds are so goal focused and so prone to falling into, like, okay, well, what's the myth going to teach me? What map? Where am I going to use the map? Where am I going to go with the map? The poetic aspect of it is to allow the thing itself to just be, which is what, you know, what nature is, and what I think existence is. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, maybe Kai Cheng.
No, I'm just really loving this whole conversation. I wish it was. We made this joke that it was 3 hours, but I wish it was. And I mean, I'm with both of you. I think, Sophie, when you mentioned embodiment and like poetry being that dialoguing with the world, and Ali, when you talk about like the shift from the map into the feeling, right? Like, to me, like this thing I'm talking about, you know, poetics being speaking the bridge into being, for me, it's like this, it is an incantatory act, right? Like it is the embodied ritual practice of linking our bodies, our physical bodies, with our spiritual ones. When we speak poetry, when we read it aloud, or maybe even when we read it from the page, because there's some magic there too, what we are doing is we are performing a spell. Like we are doing the ritual work of linking ourselves into a deeper world, an inner world, a spiritual one, and therefore becoming more dimensional. We are leaving behind the delusion that we are only math. Math was getting some comments, right? Or that we are only the physical or only the flesh, and there is something there, something beyond like productive purpose, and more like an ethereal purpose, a way of being. So, and I think too, like the notion that we have of story here in the contemporary world is one that has been really gradiated, right? Like through internet technology or computer technology, but also through the technology of the book and the novel. Like the idea that story could be separate from the oral act of poetry is relatively new. When we talk about like indigenous storytelling, there was always poetry because stories are spoken, and they're spoken with poetic technique, right? And so I just really, I think of poetry in this way as the embodied act of reclaiming our spiritual wholeness, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Mm. Thank you. I wish it was longer too, and we are, kind of heading towards the close soon. But yeah, one thing I wanted to speak to, and maybe this is a kind of curiosity around that very bridging through incantation, through speaking. I'm reminded of the scene in Oppenheimer, which again, I think was pretty well known generally prior to the film, but they captured it in the film, of course, if I recall correctly, where of course, Oppenheimer, when he detonates the bomb, I believe he utters those mortal words, right? Which is, "Now I have become destroyer of worlds," which I believe is from the Bhagavad Gita, correct? Which he was reading at the time or something, right? It's known that. And so for me, there's something really interesting about that, of course, where he's immediately like invoking and like linking to a much older myth, and in some ways bringing that into the present to kind of illuminate the kind of paradoxical apocalypse in a way that precarious moment is, and to say evoke himself as a mythic figure. And I don't picture him doing it with a kind of bravado, right? It seemed almost like a horror of like something that had been unleashed. So I have this question around, in some ways, it's like there's a lag time, right, between like myths and the times that they're in. It's not like people understand, hey, we're crafting a new myth right now. At the time it's happening, it often seems to take quite some time before it coalesces. And so I wonder, again, are we able to see even now in these times what, I'm hesitant to use the word like, are new myths being born or something like that, right? It's not quite like that, maybe, but I have some sense of, a kind of, is there some kind of instinctual sense of what is being asked of these times in order to engage differently? Because I think that's so much of what the invitation seems to be, is to come into a different relationship. So certainly modernity and capitalism's relationship of domination is sort of, the bankruptcy is apparent. But that's my question, is again, like, are myths being sort of gestated now in some ways? And maybe I'll just kind of leave it there enough to hear from anyone who wants to jump in as we kind of find our way to a close.
I think we've gone far and wide, and I would want to leave with the small and deep and say I'm very suspicious of myths that are non-local and that are deracinated, that are uprooted. And I think that myths are actually, any universal myth is not a myth. It's become a tool. I think once a myth has been uprooted from the community and the environment and the web of kin that brought it into being, it can very easily lapse into dogma. A tropical plant isn't going to thrive in the Hudson Valley where I live. That if you replant a myth somewhere else in a different culture, it loses context, it changes. It doesn't thrive, or maybe it thrives in the wrong way. And I think for me, I'm really interested in the myths that have been forgotten under our feet. that are in our the small myths that I think right now we're obsessed. I was really interested this summer in how obsessed people were with Barbie and Oppenheimer, and how much was changing in our tiny little microclimates. People were so obsessed with this conversation and not paying attention to the mismatched phenological cascades, the air quality, the strangeness, the uncanniness of this moment, and the myths that are, that they're birds that are singing the last mating song to a mate who won't show up. How can we encode that bird into our myths? So for me, I'm really interested in the small, deep myths of place where we are, and how can we really respond to those accurately right now and not get distracted by the monomyths that are kind of uprooted, and thus, they're not doing anything. They're very shiny and bright, but they're not teaching us how to feed our families and how to create a sustainable dialogue with our ecosystems. So yeah, I'm interested in the myths that are being born 2 feet from where you are.
Thank you, Sophie.
I think I could, yeah. What you just said is making me like really go deep, Sophie, particularly the piece about deracination and the lapse of myth that is derooted into dogma, which is like a primary interest of mine right now. I don't know if I think myths, I mean, yeah, this is born is not quite the right word, but I think like there is this strange proliferation of ancient myth, even master myth, like in the sense of imperial, right? That I'm very afraid of. Like the insurrectionary movement around January 6th was very much about deracinated myth, right? Like we can think about groups like the Sons of Odin, like all of the kind of like white supremacist myth making that is getting recycled now from the Nazi movement in the 30s and 40s. Yes, I think that myths are being maybe are reemerging, and for me, I think what I most long for is like the development, like the collective development of the skillfulness that it takes to work with myth, to understand myth in its context and out of its context, and to make a turn toward the kind of myth that is actually going to bring us closer to the kind of world that we want to live in, or that could actually help us envision a world where we all could live. Like imperialistic myth is antibiotic. Yes, I really love that word. It is antithetical to life and to diversity. In the spirit of going small and deep, I think I just want to like use the example here of trans people and trans like the transgender experience right now. Like we have so much history of, first of all, just like violence and murder of trans people and this resurgence of violence. And what we see there actually is a master myth, an imperial myth of the masculine is one way, the feminine is one way. It is all bodies are meant to be fitted into these myths and will murder people who don't do that. And when I think about indigenous myth, indigenous like not necessarily in a geopolitical sense, but in an embodied sense, like it is, again, a misuse of the Enlightenment and the scientific tradition to say, oh, well, this body looks this way, its composition is this quantifiable, and therefore we can assign it a gender that it did not choose. Real liberation, the kind of story making that will allow us to live in this, a better world, I think is the one where each body can feel for itself, like its interaction with the world, our own embodiment, and make the story of what the gender of our soul is, right? Like that the masculine, the feminine, or whatever other spirit, right, that we're communing with can emerge from us naturalistically. And that those around us can give us the freedom to create that myth or to draw from myth for ourselves. So, that's what I'd say. I think there is a giant struggle going on right now. And what I hope to call into being is that we all can be the magician, right? Who does the incantatory act for ourselves and those we love.
Beautiful.
beautiful.
Thank you. Ali.
What to say? This is such a complex topic. I found myself sort of wrestling with it, even as I'm sitting here, because on the one hand, I really resonate with what Sophie said a moment ago about this kind of connecting to what is here at our feet, you know. And because I was thinking about the internet, and I was thinking about actually the Bo Burnham song of a little bit of everything all of the time. You know, the internet is like this complete overwhelm of everything, including all the myths you might ever want to have access to. You know, if you want to delve into a particular culture's myth. So people are sort of in this position where they're in a position where they seemingly can pick and choose, but it's not real in that sense, right? It's a kind of echo. It's like a mimicry of something much, much deeper, more profound. At the same time, we live in very multicultural societies. Like where I live in London, it's you know, I think about this a lot. I joked with a friend a few years ago. I was like, it seems that it's hippies and Nazis both have the same thing about, like, we belong to the land, but they're meaning completely different things, you know. So there's this strange tension. And then I thought, you know, well, I mean, the most inclusive way is if everyone is, if we connect to the land that feeds us. That's where I came to. It's like, and everyone can do that, and that land belongs to everyone who's on it. In that sense, it doesn't belong to, but they're in relationship with it, right? There's this exchange. And I think that is a first step. It's that, you know, that famous line of touch grass, that kind of meme that goes around. You know, we need to in some way disconnect from the temptation of, oh, let's choose whatever myth, whatever way we want to believe from the internet, and actually connect to the lived experience, not just of the land, but of each other, of what it is to connect with one another, and I kind of find the myths that arise between us. So I think that's my, yeah, what's coming up for me right now.
Mm. Thank you, Ali. I see we are painfully out of time here in this moment. And just respecting the container, I did want to offer space for each of you just to give a little sense of where folks can find your offerings, you know, on the internet, most likely, or in person. But maybe Sophie, yeah, first with you. Oh, looks like you're muted. Yeah.
First, this has been absolutely wonderful, and I hope there are other opportunities for us to all cross-pollinate in the future. Thank you. I am online, chronically online, and I offer a lot of stuff for free because I have been a starving artist most of my life and benefited from all of the stuff other people have offered. So I have a Substack where I have, if you want, you know, upcoming books, excerpts, and a lot of, like, you know, more private stuff, you can support it financially. But if not, I offer a lot for free. I have books, Madonna's Secret, The Flowering Wand, talks. If you type my name into Google, you can find lots of free stuff. And also some embarrassing stuff from when I was in high school that I have no idea how to scrub from the internet, including fan fiction I wrote about Twilight. So.
Wow. Okay, I'm looking forward to that. Maybe Kai.
Well, I love that, Sophie. And remember, it is all going to disappear. I believe that too. So, you know, your Twilight fanfic is a temporary artifact. Let's see. Yeah, I too am online, and hopefully that is as ephemeral as we believe it to be here. I'm gonna put a couple of links in, or like handles, into the chat. Yeah, I really believe in like collective knowledge and the collective creation and ownership of knowledge. So you can find a ton of work I put out on Instagram, also on my website, and you know, some free like learning resources around somatics, embodiment, conflict, transformative justice, and storytelling. I too have some books. My most recent is actually a book of poetry, Falling Back in Love with Being Human. And if you want to fall back in love with being human, you can find that book. I always suggest supporting your local independent bookstores and not Amazon, if at all possible, or your local library. And I have several other books out there in the world as well. So yeah, I invite you to come find me, and I look forward to either hiding or connecting, depending on the mood.
Yeah, and yeah, firstly, thank you, Sophie, thank you, Cheng, thank you, Ian, thank you, Leah, and this has been really beautiful. And yeah, so I'm also on the internet too much. So my book, The Bigger Picture, is actually on an unfortunately this is Amazon related, but it is on a discount for the next 48 hours. The Kindle version. So I'm gonna put a link in there, which is a genius link, which will take you to whatever Amazon store, probably the US one for most people, if people want to check that out. And then I also write a Substack, which is also called The Bigger Picture. So people can find that. It's all on my website as well, which is alexanderbeiner.com. So yeah, leave it there.
Beautiful. Thank you all so much for this time. And yeah, people want to connect with some of the things I'm up to. themythicmasculine.com is the podcast that was mentioned. And of course, the film, The Village of Lovers, is currently touring actually in London in a couple of weeks. It'll be London and Brighton. Yeah, so Ali, hopefully you see there, and then Germany and beyond. So it's proliferating all over the place now. Check it out, thevillageoflovers.com. And of course, the School of Mythopoetics, which is really a place to gather around this kind of stuff. Check it out online. Over to you, Leah.
I just want to say, like, wow, I'm just wowed. We were joking about 3 hours. No, I went 5 hours with you guys. Thank you, Ian, so much for bringing together and cross-pollinating this really fantastic conversation. I don't know about you guys. I have to like work all these new words into my fire points, breaching, nomadic eruptions, antibiotic life, interceptive intelligence. I mean, yum. Like, thank you for just being so delicious in your expression of life. And it made me, really think about how Joseph Campbell once said, keep looking for the new myths. They're still always emerging. And I had an experience recently where I was in Ecuador, and one of the guides, I was in the Amazonian forest, and one of the guides there was local from that forest, and I said, "Do you have any stories?" I'm a storyteller. He's like, "Do you have any stories?" He's like, "Well, I've got a couple from my grandmother whose language is going. We're about to lose her language, and I have a couple of these stories." And he began to tell me his stories, and two things happened. One, I could hear the words, but I could understand that I could only understand 1% of it because I was not from that place. And that language, that story was from that place. And to really, it put into my body this deep knowing what's been being brought up is that stories are from the place or from the land. And then I also started to have this grief where I was like, oh my God, the stories are being lost. No, no. And then this like flash came, and I probably from the forest, the trees themselves were like, what a small Western minded way to think about things. Where do you think that story came from? It came from the earth. They're going back into the earth with the bones of those ancestors, with those people, and they can be caught again. And so may you keep listening to your land because it speaks out loud. The myths are still here. They're still wanting to be caught. I posted 2 links that you might really enjoy. One of them is a class that's coming up in an hour called Wilder Language of Belonging, Earth Stories and Eco-Mythology with Jackie Bichelle. She's coming in from Australia. She speaks the pace of roots growing, very different than me. I just love listening to her. And then Sophie mentioned Sean Kane. And if you're not aware of Sean Kane, the Wisdom of the Myth Teller is one of the foundational books that I recommend that everyone that comes to the school read. He is just a living treasure that is not one of those people that's going to be on Instagram or doing any of that. And he supported us in such generous ways because he's not also of this space of being here. But he said, here, have one of my stories, and why don't you guys come around and read it and wonder about it together. Such an act of generosity. So we'll be doing that tomorrow. And also meeting with one of our elders on what does it mean to be a myth maker. So keep in touch. And thank you again. If you could do something by feeding and nourishing these good people, if you want to just post some things in the chat box of like, what came alive in you? What are you receiving? What are you carrying with you? What do you want to anchor in? This is one of the ways that we feed our collective memory. There were so many things that were said. How do we co-remember them together? So I really want to encourage you to do that, while at the same time, maybe we want to open our mute boxes and sing out our voices of praise and gratitude. So I invite you all to take yourselves off mute and to sing the praise of these good people and bless them well as they go off into the world to chant other things. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
So
Gratitude.
So
Thank
magical.
you.
So inspiring.
So,
Thank you.
so good.
A feast of interceptive intelligence.
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
And so it is.
Ah, fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you.
You.
Thank you. And thanks, Leah.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Yeah.
Take care.
Peace and blessings.
Mm.